The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Economic Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Cybersecurity will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to discuss security training for mass transit and rail employees. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here today, especially our witnesses. We meet today to discuss security training programs for rail and mass transit agencies. The importance of railroads and mass transit to our daily lives and national economy cannot be understated. Mass transit, commuter rail, and freight rail are responsible for moving millions of people every day and for delivering thousands of freight shipments across the country. Subcommittees looked at the security of these important systems in a variety of ways. Last year, in the aftermath of the London subway attacks, we looked at the vulnerabilities of soft targets, including public transportation, and the security measures being taken to protect them. We also looked at the various ways the DHS and our rail and transit agencies were working to prevent a terrorist attack from ever occurring. Today, we address another important component of our security, and that is training. Thousands of employees have been trained in the years since 9/11 on security issues, and these include police officers, emergency responders, management, security officers, and sometimes frontline employees. We know that in the event of an attack on our rail or mass transit facilities, employees will often be the first people impacted by the event. They'll play a key role in managing the terror aftermath, evacuating civilians, and providing first aid, which could significantly reduce the number of lives lost. In addition, rail and transit employees are an important part in the fight to prevent an attack from ever occurring. Employees such as operators, drivers, clerks, mechanics, and other frontline employees are valuable allies watching for suspicious activity in packages. These employees who know their surroundings and work environment are well suited to identify when something or someone does not belong. It's important to note that much discussion has been given to security-specific training, and I just want to recognize that employees oftentimes receive other forms of training that may serve a dual purpose, such as emergency response training, which is applicable whether the incident was a terrorist attack or an accident. Our goal today is to hear what the federal government has been doing to provide employee training on security. In some instances, our transportation systems have gone beyond what the federal government has offered and have developed their own training courses. We look forward to learning about these as well. Security training for employees is an important part of the overall effort to implement layered security measures, and I look forward to the testimony today about the numerous efforts to train employees to recognize and respond to potential security problems, and I certainly thank our witnesses for being here. And I would recognize the only other member of the subcommittee here, Mr. Langevin, if he has any comments at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome our witnesses here today. I look forward to your testimony on this very important topic. And I am pleased that this subcommittee is holding the hearing on security training for mass transit and rail employees. I, along with many of my colleagues, particularly Ms. Sanchez, have been very concerned about the fact that most mass transit and rail employees are not receiving comprehensive training on how to recognize and report potential threats, also to protect themselves and passengers and to respond if there's an incident. Now, over the last 5 years, Congress has done a lot of talking about supporting first responders and providing them with the tools that they need. But when it comes to rail security, we must remember that in the bombings of mass transit and rail systems in Madrid, London, and Mumbai, the first people on the scene were transportation workers. Now, in the critical first few minutes after an incident, transportation workers who have received adequate training can help save lives and mitigate the damage of an attack. Now, the knowledge and experience that transportation workers have about their workplace is a critical resource in responding to an incident. We need to maximize the first responder potential of all rail and mass transit employees by ensuring that they receive substantive security training. Now, for this reason, I know my colleague, Ms. Sanchez, has proposed an amendment to the Transportation Security Authorization Bill that would have required rail and mass transit systems to establish security training programs for their workers. And during the discussion of this amendment, both Chairman King and Chairman Lundgren indicated that they wanted to learn more about this important topic before acting, and so we agreed to hold this hearing today. So I'm pleased that we were able to consider this important topic before the October recess, and I'm looking forward to discussion on all of the issues relating to employee training. And I want to thank again, the witnesses for being here to share your insights, and also, in particular, thank Chairman Lundgren for holding this hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Langevin, and other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We're pleased to have two panels of distinguished witnesses before us today on this important topic, and I just remind the witnesses that your entire written statements will appear in the record, and we would ask you to make opening 5-minute summaries of your statements. The chair would now recognize the first panel and ask Mr. John Sammon, the Assistant Administrator of the Transportation Sector Network Management Office at TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, to testify.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am pleased to have this opportunity to testify on the important subject of security training for freight rail, mass transit, and passenger rail employees. I would like to highlight some of the important steps TSA is taking in partnership with DHS, DOT, state and local government, and industry to ensure these employees receive the best training possible to protect themselves, the public, and the rail and mass transit systems. I first would like to introduce myself to the committee. I am the Assistant Administrator of TSA for the Office of Transportation Sector Network Management. TSA created that office in 2005 to open a direct line of communication and foster cooperation with the industry across 10 different modes of transportation, including mass transit and freight rail. Prior to joining TSA, I worked for more than 25 years in the transportation industry, including positions as Senior Vice President at CSX and Conrail. In these positions, I gained valuable experience working with network and customer partners to get things done. The Department of Homeland Security pursues a layered approach to security in transportation, including transit and rail security. The effort starts with gathering effective data analysis and dissemination of intelligence. The recent disruption of the terror plot in the United Kingdom and the developing plot targeting the underwater tunnels in New York and New Jersey illustrate the necessity of that approach. The best defenses are preventing the terrorists from ever reaching their targets and by creating visible, unpredictable deterrence environments to disrupt their planning capabilities. Transit and rail employees are a part of America's first line of defense and will be among our first responders in the event of a terrorist attack or other disruption in the transit system. We depend on their vigilance and observations to detect indicators of a developing plan or attack. The actions taken by these individuals in the critical moments immediately after an attack or disruption can significantly reduce the severity of injuries and the number of deaths. As a result, there is simply no substitute for security awareness and emergency response training for the nation's transit and rail employees. We must rely on and cultivate human capabilities to prevent, deter, detect, and respond to security threats. These skills can be acquired through extensive training, rigorous emergency planning, and regular emergency testing and drills. We recognize that TSA and the transit and rail industry need to provide more training for more employees. While there are a number of cooperative initiatives being undertaken, the real story comes with the Transit Security Grant Program. It is TSA's intention to leverage this program to ensure that qualifying systems meet certain baseline standards. These standards include frontline employee awareness training, frontline employee response training, and emergency drill training. These in addition to incident response plans, vulnerability assessments, mitigation plans, and visible, unpredictable deterrence programs. By leveraging in excess of $100 million in security grants in fiscal year 2006 and $175 million in fiscal year 2007, TSA can focus the transit agencies on training before technology. And we can use that transit grant funding to bring training up to baseline standards across the nation. TSA is acutely aware of the importance of training in the freight rail area. In this year, in conjunction with DOT, we issued a list of recommended security action items for rail carriers for the transport of toxic inhalation hazard materials. The list included recommendations that relate directly to continued education and training. 4 video training modules have been developed by the railroad industry over the past several years covering security awareness training. These video training modules help frontline employees identify potential security breaches, threats, risks, and underscore the importance of reporting. Our general manager of Freight Rail has over 30 years field operating experience in the railroad industry as general manager and vice president. He has directed our rail inspectors to conduct an initial assessment of how well the classroom training translates to security compliance in the day-to-day activities of the frontline employees. This assessment will include all rail carriers that transport toxic inhalation railcar shipments. In addition to the rail industry's training program, we are currently developing an interactive training program on the recognition of explosive devices on rail cars and rail property. This will be made available to the rail carriers at no cost in coming months. In summary, we value the critical role of Congress and especially the subcommittee plays in the effort to protect rail security. We look forward to working with you in the future to achieve this goal. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to respond to any questions later.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sammon, for your testimony. The chair would now recognize Mr. Terry Rosapep, the Deputy Associate Administrator, Office of Program Management at the Federal Transit Agency, to testify. I understand that while you'll be testifying for the Department of Transportation, we'll also have Mr. William Fagan, the Director of Security at the Federal Railroad Administration, to answer questions regarding training for rail at DOT. Thank you both for being here, and sir, you may proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman Sanchez, Congressman Langevin, and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to have this opportunity to discuss security training for transit and railroad employees and the Department of Transportation's initiatives in that area, first by highlighting the Federal Transit Administration's involvement in transit security, and then the involvement by the Federal Railroad Administration. The FTA, its federal and state partners, and the transit industry have built a solid foundation for security by focusing on three priorities: public awareness, emergency preparedness, and employee training. Since 9/11, FTA has delivered security training to almost 80,000 transit employees in an ongoing collaboration with NTI, the National Transit Institute of Rutgers University, DOT's Transportation Safety Institute, and the Johns Hopkins University. FTA now coordinates security training through the Public Transportation Annex to the DOT-DHS Memorandum of Understanding, which sets out the respective roles of the departments on security issues. The Annex's Executive Steering Committee oversees 8 project management teams. The training team looks specifically at how to develop new courses on timely security topics. The Safety and Security Roundtables team also enhances security training through direct outreach to the security chiefs at the 50 largest transit agencies. Another team is dedicated to the Transit Watch program, which is tantamount to a security training for passengers. In partnership with Johns Hopkins, FTA has developed and is delivering a course on strategic counterterrorism for transit managers. In addition, a security training assessment for the largest 30 transit agencies and also for 20 smaller ones is being completed, and that will give us a better baseline to determine training needs throughout the industry. With NTI, FTA is working to deliver several security training courses. These include Chem Bio and Explosive Incident Management, as well as System Security Awareness, which imparts basic security skills to frontline employees. FTA has collaborated with DOT's Transportation Safety Institute on 6 specific security training courses. Topical areas include security design review principles, bus and rail hijackings, and response to threats posed by weapons of mass destruction. Turning to FRA, FRA promotes the safety of the U.S. railroad industry and works closely with its federal and state partners in the railroad industry in addressing training and other security issues. In the area of freight rail security, FRA worked closely with the DOT's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, on a March 2003 regulation requiring each shipper and carrier of significant quantities of hazmat to adopt and comply with a security plan. PHMSA regulations require each company to give its employees both security awareness training and in-depth security training concerning the company's security plan and its implementation. To date, FRA has reviewed more than 6,000 security plans and conducted some 4,000 inspections for compliance with the regulation's security training requirements. Further, in June of this year, FRA, TSA, and the railroads agreed on voluntary security action steps the industry should take to enhance security in the transportation of toxic inhalation hazard materials, TIH. The action items include regularly reinforcing security awareness and operational security concepts to all employees, and training employees to recognize suspicious activity, to report security concerns stemming from inspection of cars containing TIH materials. FRA and TSA have also assisted the freight railroads with instituting their own, more comprehensive security plans and have provided input to employee security training modules, which the railroads and NTI are now developing. In the area of passenger railroad security, FRA issued regulations in 1998 requiring passenger railroads to prepare and secure FRA approval of plans to address emergencies, conduct employee training on the plans, and conduct emergency simulations. In addition, Amtrak and the commuter railroads have instituted their own security plans and conduct their own security training. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, be assured that the Department of Transportation will continue to work with DHS to strengthen transit and rail security. We look forward to continuing to work with Congress to advance the shared goal of protecting our transit and rail infrastructure. We will be happy to answer any of the questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Appreciate it. Thank both the witnesses, and I thank you, Mr. Fagan, for being here to respond to questions as well. We'll start the round of questioning, and I will yield myself 5 minutes for that purpose. We're going to have a second panel here, and we have a number of representatives, two representatives of unions involved in the industry. And the tenor of one of the prepared statements is that we would hear a lot of good things from the administration, but that in fact it's more talk than action, and the suggestion that the good work done by the National Transit Institute only represents training approximately 30% of the transit industry's total workforce. Mr. Sammon and Mr. Rosapep, how would you respond to that? I mean, I view that as a criticism, and I would like you to give us an answer.
Thank you. Let me start first. In terms of the overall federal spending that's available in the transit, or that is available, DHS makes available has made available about $18 billion to state and local governments, and they use that money in various and sundry ways, whether they use it for first responders, transit, however they have been making decisions on that. There is about $4 billion or $3.5 billion a year available from FTA capital grants that there's more flexibility to use with training and also for capital security items. And I think from since 9/11, approximately $900 million from all federal agencies has been available for transit security. Now, in terms of the question of training, that's why what we want to do at TSA is TSA is now working with DHS in a lead role on the grants program. And what we want to do is, rather than have the grants go out simply for capital items, we want to require a baseline of training before people are eligible for capital grants. So we want to leverage that excess of $100 million to get the properties their frontline employee training up to standards. And that's what we plan to do, we want to do. And working with the unions, I worked at Conrail for quite some time, and we had at one point one of the worst safety records, and we turned it around to have one of the best safety records. And we did that by working with the people on the ground directly. Every one of our senior officers was out working with folks on the ground. So I think the frontline employees at some point in this process should be involved, and it's very important because their attitude and their involvement take you from having a training and awareness program that is on paper versus a real robust one in the field.
Is it Rosapep or Rosapep? I want to make sure.
It's Rosapep.
Okay. Mr. Rosapep, could you respond to that, please?
Yeah, I would say that, since 9/11, the training programs have in fact been focused on the largest 30 transit agencies as opposed to all of the systems out there. So we have a higher penetration of the top 30 agencies, probably more like 60% of the employees. But overall, the 20% figure is correct. As an example, in your district, we've been focusing on getting out the basic security awareness course to those top 30 agencies. We've done Sacramento in your district. In Congresswoman Sanchez's district, we've done the Orange County transit system to get the basic security programs out there. But those are the larger ones. We are right now conducting an assessment of not only those top 30 to see how well we've penetrated and the training has gone down in those agencies, but we're also looking at a selection of 20 smaller agencies across the country as well, because we also think those are important. When we have that assessment complete, I think we'll have a much better idea of what it's going to take to do the training that's necessary at the larger systems as well as the smaller ones, and get a broader penetration throughout the industry of the training that's really necessary.
Have you had an opportunity to look at some of the systems themselves? That is, you say in Orange County and Sacramento, they've had the training. In testimony that we have coming up later from one of the union representatives mentions that the Washington, D.C. System has had training, the L.A. Metro have trained their frontline employees, at least that's their statement. Have you had any opportunity to go in and look at the quality of that training that actually took place? I guess I'd ask you this way, are there any metrics, are there any performance standards, is there anything to show that it's taken?
That really is part of the assessment we're doing, is to go back to those agencies that we have trained in the top 30 to see just how has it been effective, and if it hasn't, why not, and what can we do about it. Frankly, we have another parallel effort going on to actually define some performance metrics for training. All of us are party to this effort. But that'll give us an ongoing way of measuring just how effective the training is on an ongoing basis.
Do you have any sense whether these systems sense the importance of this? That is, if you look at the bottom line of an operation, preparing for a terrorist attack in many cases might be the outlier. It's something that we don't think is going to happen. That could be the comment or the thought of an operator. Therefore, we can't justify it to our bottom line. Do we have that problem, or is there a seriousness that you find with the operators you deal with that actually they understand how important this is?
Our experience so far, it's not an issue of that. They sense the importance of it and are eager to get the training. The other side of it, too, is so much of what we call security training is just as applicable to safety issues. In fact, it's hard to define a clear line between the two. And the fact is, our transit agencies have been doing safety training and safety programs for years and years. They know the importance of it. Some of these new security programs add a new twist to it, but it's not something that they have to be convinced of that it's something that they would like and need to do.
Okay, my time is up. The gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Sanchez, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry for arriving late, but I do thank you for this hearing. I think it's very important because I've been hearing from a lot of different areas with respect to training and the security on the different rail lines in particular. So let me get this. I'm a little concerned about, in talking to people, about the perceived lack of coordination between the Department of Homeland Security and Transportation. There appears to be a lot of overlap and duplication with regards to security training. And, there's very few resources. I mean, I used to do transportation consulting many decades ago, and so really understand, in particular for mass transit, what it takes to move people and where the monies are coming from and the lack of monies. So who is the primary department and agency responsible for security training? And what steps are you taking to improve the coordination between the two departments? And my second question has to deal with this issue of whether TSA is just acting as a pass-through to give monies then over to, let's say, FTA for this security training. It seems to me that there recently was, for example, a $1.5 million transfer from TSA to the FTA, and another $200,000 transfer that was made last year. So is TSA developing the training? Is it just moving the money over to FTA? Should we just be giving the money directly to FTA? What's the coordination, and who's really doing this? And if you answered this before I walked in, I'm sorry, but I need to sort of understand.
No, that's a very good question. I think if you go back before 9/11, as discussed a few minutes ago, most of the training and efforts in terms of security and safety were handled by the FTA. And those things, and in many cases, if you think about security, am I going to be mugged or is this a terrorist attack? A lot of the things involved, there is a fine line in terms of separating both of them. So in the past, and in their roles of dealing with the nation's transit agencies, FTA, when the testimony has gone through, developing a number of training programs and dealing with the agencies. In my discussions with the agencies, they want to deal with, it's fine the federal government has all these different security agencies, but in terms of if you're going to have programs and training programs, and we're going to do training, for instance, if you do safety training and you take an operator out of his equipment for the day, and he's going to be in a room, you can do both safety training and security training. And security training can be against criminal, and it can also be terrorist security training. It's effective to do it all at once in modules. So a lot of the development of the training programs has been developed by FTA, and TSA supports that effort. What TSA is doing, and what we want to do, is in terms of setting, are the transit agencies at a baseline standard of training? Are they there? And we want to use the grant program through DHS as the incentive to get people to the baseline of training. The other part of my oral testimony today, we mentioned that what we're doing in the rail industry has developed a four-part module in terms of training for rail employees on security awareness and so on. What we want to do with our inspectors is to make sure that to see the effectiveness as that applies to the ground, their day-to-day activities, and how that applies. So I think in terms of this, TSA is working. We have a memorandum of understanding with FTA and FRA. We work closely with them in terms of these issues.
My last question to you. It's my understanding that TSA has frozen all promotions and hiring for rail and mass transit officials at TSA, in addition to halting initiatives in these areas due to funding shortfalls. Is there a shortfall?
What we have, I recently hired the general manager of rail promoted Gil Kovar, who's sitting in the audience here. He has 30 years experience in the rail industry as a senior line operating person. We have made permanent 9 of the 11 general managers since I arrived, and we hope to have a transit general manager here shortly. So we have been hiring people. We brought on an air cargo executive on Monday who is retired, who is from Emory Worldwide. So we have been hiring people. In terms of
So you haven't frozen promotions or stopped hiring of rail and mass transit officials?
I haven't stopped any hiring per se. What I have done since I've gotten there in terms of looking at the overall resource of the group that I have, I want to make sure that the resources are in the right place. We may have too many people in one area and not enough people in the other, and I'm making that determination. So before I fill jobs just because they were there before, I want to make sure we're filling the right jobs in the right places, and that TSA is putting its resources and using its resources most effectively.
Okay, let me ask it just one different way. I see that my time is up. So there is no freezing of hiring into positions
I
in your
just
shop.
hired the cargo general manager on Monday, but I have told people what I want to do.
What about the lower rungs? Is there an official freeze?
There is not an official freeze. There is, what we are doing is, in terms of the vacancies we have, I want a review and justification of all the vacancies in terms of the priorities of TSA to make sure we're putting people in the right jobs rather than filling historic vacancies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you again for your testimony, for being here today. One of my concerns in terms of what I've heard both from constituents and just on a general topic is related to Amtrak police officers, and I'm sure that we all agree that if you want to hire and retain good people, we have to pay them fairly. So I'm going to address my question to Mr. Fagan. Mr. Fagan, as the Director of Security for the Federal Railroad Administration, you probably understand more than most people do the need for a steady workforce of railroad police officers. Railroad police officers obviously serve on the front lines to ensure passenger safety. They're responsible for ensuring both the trains and the stations are secure and assisting passengers with any security concerns that they may have. It's therefore important that they be compensated fairly and granted equitable contracts under which to work. Now, while I understand that you don't work for Amtrak, I'm sure that you have heard that Amtrak's police officers have been operating now without a contract for 7 years. 7 years. Now, the Amtrak police officers, right now, as I understand it, are not paid commensurate with what their counterparts working for other rail companies make. Additionally, while they do receive cost of living adjustments, they are less than adequate, often amounting to an increase of 1 penny a month. So this leads to the unfortunate truth that much of Amtrak's important police force leave to find better paying jobs, which ultimately leaves gaping holes in rail security. So my question is, have you heard this problem occurring, and do you think the Amtrak police officers should be operating under an updated contract? And do you think that this is a problem confined to Amtrak, or is it spilling over into other railroad police officers? And finally, in your capacity as the Director of Security for the Federal Railroad Administration, what can you do to help ensure Amtrak retains its important police force?
Sir, I'm very proud of our police officers at Amtrak. Throughout the railroad.
Sir, your mic, would you press the button?
Sorry, sir. I'm very proud of our police officers, both in the railroad and transit industry and in our local communities. Amtrak pay and personnel policies are an internal matter to the company, and we will review that question and provide you an answer in writing, sir.
I would appreciate that. Obviously, 7 years, I think, even to the reasonable person, is a long time to go without a contract. And if it's true that they're only getting about a penny a month increase in their cost of living adjustment, that's certainly not adequate. Doesn't speak well of morale, I'm sure, and it's going to be harder and harder to retain good people. Particularly in this day and age, I think that's an important topic to address. If I could, my next question for Mr. Sammon. We witnessed the horrible events that unfolded during the attacks on London subway system just over a year ago, and we're fortunate that here in the United States we have not yet experienced that type of attack, and we're currently severely, in my opinion, underprepared to handle the results. Now, not only do we lack the capability to prevent such attacks from happening, but many of our nation's subway systems are still not cell phone accessible, which means that it could take first responders an even longer time to hear about the attacks. Now, I understand that the Washington Metro system is fortunately able to accommodate the use of cell phones along much of the tracks. However, cell phones simply cannot operate in much of the New York City subway system, where most threats to our nation's mass transit have been received. So the fact that many of our nation's subway systems lack the ability to allow for the use of cell phones leaves our mass transit systems extremely vulnerable to attack. So my question, Mr. Sammon, do you see this as a problem to our mass transit system, and how do you propose that we act to make all of our nation's subway systems cell phone accessible?
That's a very good question, and I think what we would, in terms of the cell phone specific, I don't have, the TSA has a specific plan on cell phones. Part of it, what we're looking for is the subway systems in the context of the grant program, is what is their response program, and part of that response program certainly is communication, and communication with from the operators to the first responders. I don't have we don't have a specific plan that for cell phones specifically. However, if you look at the risk-based distribution of our grant money in the past, it has gone to one of the items that goes into determining that risk-based assessment is miles of underground track and underground stations. So certainly the systems that have the kinds of vulnerabilities that you're speaking to have received in the past most of the funding. And I will bring up the cell phone and communication, make sure that we do have that as an important part of that recognition of the kinds of grants and applications we look at. Because certainly, when we talk about response plans and effective response plans, if you can't communicate, you can't respond.
Well, that's exactly my concern as well, and we don't want to be talking about it after the fact. The opportunity is here to do something about it now, and we certainly welcome the opportunity to work with you on that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the testimony of the witnesses. Mr. Sammon, why hasn't TSA required security training for rail and mass transit employees?
We are working with the transit industry to develop a plan, a one-year action plan, which includes, among other things, would be training. We are.
I mean, this seems to me this would be like the first thing we would do, but now it's 5 years have gone by, and we still don't require training. So are we just leaving it up to the transit agencies and the railroads to do this training themselves?
In the discussion we had before in the oral testimony, what I spoke about was using the excess of $100 million in the grants program.
Who does that money go to?
That goes to the transit agencies.
But still, there's not a requirement that they use it for training.
There will be, and that's what we are doing, and that's what we're changing in response to the recognition. First of all, the training is critical. Training is essential. And in the past, in terms of the grants program, agencies could apply for training. They most apply for capital grants, but in their assessments of what's important, they have applied for training. They have not applied for as many training programs. Some have, as they have applied for capital. And what we want to do is raise a bar and have that bar set as we look at this next distribution of funds to say, if you're not trained, and we're not, in our opinion, to a proper level, we don't want to hand out money for technology before you do training. So we may see in this next round a larger portion of that 130 or so million dollars go for training than has in the past, because it doesn't do any good for me to pay.
When can we expect this requirement?
This requirement will, as we go through the next, the 06, the specifics in terms of what the specific projects will be approved, it will start coming out there. Now, will it be?
You mean 07?
Well, we
got about 2 weeks to go, or a few days to go in 06.
Well, no, the amounts have been released, but the specific projects and what will apply and how the money, which projects apply, that will be done by the end of the year. Certainly by 07, and will it be done perfectly this first time? Probably not. But for 07, people will understand the guidance and the requirements. But the training we want is no good. It doesn't do anybody any good to buy them a chem bio detection unit if the employees don't know how to get out of the subway system or aren't trained to evacuate. So they have to be trained first before we start layering in lots of technology on these systems. But we agree with the committee's assessment there.
Mr. Rosapep, do you think the TSA should mandate security training for mass transit employees?
We're prepared. When you mandate something, we need to be prepared that we have the resources to make sure that the training is available so that the transit agency can take care of that. We concur with the notion of that the training has got to be there before people start buying technology, and FTA has been pushing that ourselves for a number of years. The courses that we've been pushing are those basic security awareness training for all of the frontline staff. That plays in better to accomplishing that before funding goes into the hard capital side of things. FTA's own programs this year, people are now able to use their FTA capital formula funds for training purposes. That wasn't possible before this year. So there are new resources being made available for those agencies to be able to get the training that, that they need and want.
Okay. So you're saying until this year, the money that we gave them was not available for training?
From FTA's formula programs, they're strictly capital for the large agencies.
Right.
So the things for training and conducting emergency drills and preparing plans are operational, and they weren't eligible before. When Congress passed the new Safety Lieu legislation for the transportation programs, they changed the definition of what's capital for FTA and for our transit agencies so that they can address security operational things such as training.
Mr. Fagan, do you think TSA should mandate security training for rail employees?
Sir, the Federal Railroad Administration mandates emergency training for passenger railroad employees as well as security training for hazmat employees. In the passenger arena, we take a triad approach of training the frontline crew employees, personnel in the dispatch and control centers, as well as the local emergency responders.
Can I just, Mr. Chairman, I know let me ask one, give me this again.
TSA is responsible for transportation security. While FRA may be doing this, why is TSA not doing it?
FRA is doing this, right, as you said, but TSA is supposed to be responsible for this. Why are you doing it if TSA isn't doing it? Do you get my drift here? TSA is supposed to do this, right?
In terms of training,
Yeah,
yes, and that's why we wanted to use.
for rail employees now, I'm talking about.
That's why my general manager is sending his inspectors out to make sure that the training that has been in place from the rail industry is effective and in place in the field.
But we're not requiring it.
We are, in terms of required, the training, well,
Mandatory, in other words, a rule that you have to do it.
Right, right.
Let me ask you one quick thing, Mr. Chairman. What about ferries? I come from the Pacific Northwest, the Bremerton area. Who's in charge of ferry security? We've had some issues out there, as you know, and I just wanted to know, is TSA, I know the Coast Guard has probably been playing the lead role here,
Right.
which is probably appropriate, but who is supposed to be in charge of this?
Well, in most areas, the Coast Guard, but there are grants that are applicable in terms of security grants that TSA directs for that area. But generally, in many of the maritime areas, the Coast Guard does have a lead role because there are regulations, maritime regulations that go back for many, many years that involve the Coast Guard.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the program that they've developed is pretty good, by the way, for the ferry system. And they have the dogs and everything. They're doing as much security as they can without completely disrupting the ferry system. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I think we'll try a second round here, and I'll start off. And Mr. Rosapep, you mentioned in your both prepared and oral testimony that you focus on three security priorities: public awareness, employee training, and emergency preparedness. I want to ask you about public awareness. I would dare say that for most people who ride on airplanes today, they're aware of the threat. They would respond differently today than what happened on 9/11 because we recognize the tactics of the terrorists have changed. But it strikes me that the average person who rides on mass transit probably doesn't have that same awareness of what the threat would be, how to respond to it, what they should do. When you say that your department, your agency is involved in public awareness, what do you mean by that?
The primary transit awareness program is the Transit Watch program, which actually is now jointly being funded by DHS and DOT. That program was started a few years ago. It's locally, if you go on Metro, you hear the warning signs all the time, you know, looking for unattended bags, looking for suspicious behaviors, trying to get people to understand what to look for. If they see it, who do they report that information to?
Again, what are the metrics on that? I mean, sometimes I see we have created scenarios by regulation that are so broad that after a while people don't pay any attention to them. If you tell everybody, for instance, my home state of California, where under Prop 65 we have to warn people that you might be exposed to certain cancer-causing agents at very, very, very low amounts, but we require every hotel, every convenience store, every supermarket to post that. People walk by it, they don't pay any attention, it doesn't mean anything to them. There are other parts of Prop 65 that work, but in that regard, we've overdone it so that nobody pays any attention. Has there been any study to go back and say, hey, these notices of people to do that actually cause them to be aware of that, number one? And number two, do you have anything that shows you how well passengers are responding, that is, are reporting when there does seem to be a suspicious package someplace?
We haven't completed a formal assessment of that program, but that's exactly the type of thing we need to do as these programs develop, is to determine, do they get stale and no one's paying attention to them anymore? I think just some of the feedback we've been getting is transit agencies are getting lots of calls about looking at suspicious packages, unattended bags left on transit vehicles. So that message is still alive and is still out there, and people are paying attention to it. So at this stage of the game, I don't think it's a stale message. We've added new wrinkles to it this year, again, that we want the agencies to start emphasizing not only the unattended bags, but getting messages out there about how to evacuate the systems if it's necessary. I think that's particularly an area where most people don't pay any attention to it. They don't want to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you would compare that to airlines, I would suspect most people, even though we kind of have our eyes glazed over when they talk about us sitting in the emergency exit rows and when they give the demonstration, most people, despite themselves, are paying somewhat attention, know where they're supposed to follow, how they're supposed to go, and those sorts of things. But I don't sense the same thing on mass transit.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right, which is why, again, the new version of Transit Watch for this year that we're just rolling out now is starting to put emphasis on the agencies developing and communicating the evacuation plans for their customers and trying to get the word out so they understand how it works. I think that's going to take some time. You know, every system is a little different, so it's not a one standard way of how do you evacuate these systems. But I think as some systems, and Washington Metro locally is putting some emphasis on the whole evacuation part of it. I think as we learn from some of these efforts, we can exchange what works best between other systems across the country, but it is
Well, just for instance, I would presume that certain things that you do if you're in a tunnel are different than the things that you do when you're not in a tunnel.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm not sure that I've ever heard anybody, when I go on a mass transit system, anybody say that. Explain to me what I should or should not do, as opposed to when I just get on and you tell me look for suspicious packages. It just seems to me to be a total sense of unawareness. I mean, we've all been in systems where they slow down in a tunnel and they announce to you that they've got a couple trains ahead of you, you're going to have to wait. And you sit there in darkness. Well, you're not in darkness, but it's dark outside the cab. And frankly, your reaction is, what would I do if I were told to evacuate? I wouldn't have the foggiest idea. I think most people sense. Whereas on an airplane, I think people at least have some sense. And I guess what I'm saying is there's a huge cleavage between where we are with airlines and where we are with mass transit, just in terms of public awareness, and I think public confidence if you had a crisis.
I'm in agreement with you on the whole evacuation part of things. There's a lot more work to be done in that area. And again, the changes we're doing to Transit Watch for this year is just the beginning, I think, of what needs to be done.
Okay. All right. Ms. Sanchez is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last year, Chris Kazub of the National Transit Institute testified before a committee on training for mass transit employees. In his testimony last year, he stated that the NTI and FTA's training had reached about 20% of transit employee workforce, which we believe is about 300,000 people. And as of today, that number would be a little bit more than 30%. NTI is not even near the halfway point of getting this security training done. So can I ask both Mr. Sammon and Mr. Rosapep, what steps have been taken to reach the remaining 70%? And in what time frame do we think we're going to get these people the security training we would like to see them have?
Thank you. It's a very good question, and it's one of the things that we are concerned about. And again, that's why we want to refocus the grants program to make sure that the eligibility for the grants is tied to training. And it may turn out that, a large portion of the grants program turns from capital to training. But we do expect that the training component of this has to be a fundamental baseline that people meet before we go off and buy complex or other hardening systems or other security systems. If the employees aren't trained, we think that they are the front line and the first requirement before we look at grants.
And so what's the timeline? I mean, are you going to get the 70% that still aren't trained, at least one training class by the end of this fiscal year coming up?
No, I doubt that. I would say that you'll get, as people become aware of the changing guidelines, that you'll have more people trained. The transit workforce is, the airline workforce, you're dealing with a controlled environment. You have a controlled plane, you have a controlled airport. It's a much more controlled transit. You have buses running all over the place. You have stops. You have, we haul in transit many more times the ridership than we do in air. So I would say it's going to take more time.
But you don't have any set metrics, any milestones? You haven't even projected this out?
Right now, what we are doing is taking an assessment. We expect to have as an assessment at the end of the year for many of the properties to know where their training stands and the types of training, whether it's awareness training or response training, and we're going to start there and use that for the grants process.
Let me ask you a quick question before I have Mr. Rosapep answer this previous question. TSA employs over 40,000 people. We know that the majority of these people are related to aviation security. In fact, from the numbers that I have, only 10 people work in the mass transit section at TSA. Why are there only 10 people?
There are 10 people in mass transit. There are about 10 or 12 in rail. Each of the policy areas has a limited number of people. The 40,000 people are largely baggage screeners and employee or passenger screeners that are out in the field at airports. The screeners, their supervisors, and so on. And that's the majority of the expense that TSA has there. But
so you're telling me that in TSA, yes, most of these people are actual people, hands-on, and while you only have 10 people who are planning in the mass transit section, and you have 10 people in the rail section, so does that mean you only have 10 people in management for TSA that aren't actually baggage checkers or people security checkers? I mean, what's the number for the aviation component?
That's a good question. The comparable number of people in airports is 5. The comparable number of people in airlines is under 10. So the same, to make that comparison is not a direct comparison. But the number of policy planning people in airports and airlines is under 20, and it's about the same number of people in mass transit and rail.
But you have the same number for mass transit in the entire United States, but not per airport.
No. Airlines, what I have in TS&M, that you're comparing the 10 people for mass transit and rail, the 10 rail, 10 mass transit, I have approximately 10 for airlines and approximately 5 for airports.
So you only have 15 in total nationally?
That are at the TSA office that do the same kind of work of the people that you're comparing for mass transit and rail, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time is over.
I have no further questions, Mr.
Okay, well, we thank the panel very much for their testimony. You might be advised that members may send to you written questions, additional questions. I would ask you to respond to those in writing. And we thank you once again for participating. We now have the opportunity for a second panel. And I would ask them to come forward, Mr. Ed Wytkind, Mr. John Tolman, Chief Polly Hanson, and Mr. Edward Hamberger.
Chief, I think I had called you third.
We thank you all for coming. We have a distinguished second panel to discuss the issue of frontline defense, security training for mass transit and rail employees. As I mentioned to the first panel, your written testimony will be included in the record in its entirety. So I'd ask each of you to confine your statements to approximately 5 minutes for summary, and then we will take questions. The chair is now privileged to recognize Mr. Ed Wytkind, the president of the Transportation Trades Department of the AFL-CIO, to testify. Sir.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ms. Sanchez and Mr. Dix. It's certainly good to be before the committee. Thank you for providing transportation labor this opportunity. I think after listening to the first panel, it's clear to us that our government continues to do way too much assessing, debating, evaluating, studying, and hiring of consultants to look at the problems, and we're now 5 years since September 11th, and rail and transit systems really remain unsecure still in America. And specifically to the topic of this hearing, I don't really know what workforce our government and many of our employers think they're training. The workforce that I'm talking to, the workers that I very recently spoke to about 3 or 4 days ago, very local representatives who are workers in the freight and the passenger rail industry, they're telling me that they're not receiving training for security. And those that are receiving it kind of second, third hand through videos and brochures and pocket guides. And I've been listening for 5 years about how workers are training. And it was interesting in questions asked by the committee to the first panel. It's kind of shocking to me to hear the Federal Transit Administration say that they're still assessing, what needs to be done and how the training's being done in the field. I have a tough time evaluating what the gentleman from the TSA said about the grant program and how they're going to begin to somehow condition these grants on worker training. I have no confidence in that. The Congress has a chance to get the job done on worker security training after 5 years since 9/11 in the pending port security bill that has now been expanded, or at least there's consideration of expansion to include rail and transit in there. And in that bill, mandated training is what's pending if the bill gets completed. That's how you will get the next panel you have before the committee, perhaps in the coming months, to be able to come before you and talk about how workers are actually being trained and how they're operating under a mandate. Until that mandate is in place, I believe the problems that were very adequately raised by you, Mr. Chairman, by Ms. Sanchez, and by Mr. Dix, who in a few exchanges with the first panel really pointed out just how little is being done. And I heard a lot of double speak and a lot of excuse making. And frankly, I've been listening to that for 5 years. And while I may sound a little too hard-edged about it, I've testified many times before the House and the Senate on this very topic. And I started working on this issue literally weeks after September 11th. And it's actually shocking to me that we're still having a debate with our government about whether workers should be trained to deal with security and terrorism risks in the transportation system. I think, Chairman Lundgren, your comments about some of the things that aren't being done to have passengers kind of know what's going on around them, to understand what they ought to be doing in the event of an attack, it's not dissimilar to what I'm hearing from Amtrak workers and from mass transit workers. To this day, at least 60% of mass transit workers are telling their union that they're not getting any training. To this day, Amtrak workers are still telling us that the training they're getting is abysmal. I looked at the video that the railroad industry likes to tout, and I'm sure it'll be touted in a few minutes. The video is appalling. It doesn't train workers. There is no guarantee that they'll know what they're doing. It's frankly a low-budget video that multi-billion-dollar corporations ought to be able to do a better job of producing. And worst of all, no matter how good the pamphlets are, no matter how good the brochures are, no matter how effective the NTI's training curriculum is, which, by the way, they do a good job, If the workers at the ground level, at the rank and file level, do not receive the training in classroom-style environment, with recurring training, with updated training, with security briefings for workers, with the proper communications tools, in addition to passengers not having the ability to communicate by cell, the workers don't have the ability to communicate with each other along much of the rail system. I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Tolman, may talk about that. So I had a lot of prepared remarks for this, and I did submit a comprehensive statement, but the panel that you had before us really deserved to be up here another 3 or 4 hours, because it is appalling to the labor movement that we're still debating 5 years after 9/11 about whether workers ought to be trained to deal with security risks in the United States of America. I don't know why we're still there. I'm proud to see that the Congress is stepping in to try to fill the gap, but it really is time to get the job done and have workers in this country trained. Thank you for allowing me the time.
Thank you, Mr. Wytkind. And now the chair would recognize Mr. John Tolman, the Vice President and National Legislative Representative of the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Lundgren and Ranking Member Sanchez and members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today and appreciate the interest that Congress has taken on this issue. I could almost echo my colleague Ed Wytkind's testimony to every word he said. However, I did prepare a brief statement and I will, run through it. I represent approximately 70,000 members of the Teamsters Rail Conference, was made up of Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen and Brotherhood of Maintenance Away Workers. Now, the issue of rail security is a vital concern for all rail workers and general public, and each and every day we are on the front lines of our nation's transportation system and see the woeful lack of security on the railroads. The lack of security is more than just troubling, it's tragic. It's tragic because we have seen the damage that can be done by these accidents on the railroads and shudder to think of the damage that could be wrought by the terrorists or sabotage. It's frightening to think today that after more than 250 terror attacks on railroads worldwide from '95 to 2005, since June of 2005, since June of 2005, we've seen attacks in London, India, and in the past 11 years, there have only been one successful attack in the United States, and that's in Hyder, Arizona, on October 9, 1995. It killed an Amtrak employee and injured 78 other people. This case has not been solved today, and more recently there have been plans uncovered their attempted attacks on New York subways on 3 different occasions. The frequency and severity of the attacks on railroads worldwide and here at home demonstrate the urgency for change in the way the rail security system works. However, our current regulations are severely inadequate. As you know, the Department of Homeland Security and Transportation Security Administration spend $9 per day per passenger on security, but only 1 cent per rail mass transit passenger. This is pittance when compared to the number of riders each day on our nation's rail and mass transit. Each weekday, 11.3 million passengers in 35 metropolitan areas and 22 states use some form of rail or mass transit. These passengers ride over trains that cover 10,000 miles of commuter rail and urban rail lines. The very nature of the rail system makes it vulnerable for attack. In addition to more than 10,000 miles of commuter rail, urban rail lines, and there are over 300,000 miles of freight rail lines. These lines are open and easily accessible to the public. In response to these concerns, we've taken a number of actions. For example, the BMWE and the BLET have drafted model security legislation that's been introduced at state level in every section of the country. This legislation, we believe, would accomplish, among most important, is training and whistleblower protection. Also in May, a meeting with the Federal Railroad Administration Rail Safety Advisory Committee that 2 of our state legislative directors made a presentation currently available with a locking device for locomotive automatic brake valves. These locks would prevent unauthorized person from moving a locomotive, are already in use in some European countries and other parts of the world. Ultimately, the strongest response to potential security threats faced by the railroad and transit industries begin in this House. And we applaud this committee for taking this issue up. We would ask for your consideration for H.R. 4954. We believe that that addresses some of our concerns. When we did a survey of over 4,000 of our members, 84% of them said they received absolutely zero training post 9/11, and that was in 04 to 05. This is a major concern for us, and we look forward to working with you to try to help correct this issue today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now the chair recognizes Chief Polly Hanson, Metro Transit Police Department of the Washington Metro Area Transit Authority to testify.
Good morning, Chairman Lundgren and members of the committee. My name is Polly Hanson. I am the chief of the Metro Transit Police here in Washington, D.C. The Metro Transit Police was established in 1976 with the mission of providing the security of Metro's customers, employees, facilities, and revenues, and preventing crime. The recent bombings in Madrid, London, did call for a top-to-bottom re-emphasis and re-energizing of our entire workforce on anti-terror, emergency response procedures, and training. We did work with NTI and FTA in the development of the warning signs video and the brochures that have been referred to. And we do and have offered that training in situations where there is someone, generally a transit police officer, or a trained instructor to discuss what people see and to reemphasize the procedures. We also have this on our intranet so that non-operational employees may view the video, which has been shown in management meetings as well. And we look forward to working with both FTA and NTI in the development of the next series of trainings or warning signs too. We've supplemented our existing training working with NTI to develop specialized training for employees who maintain escalators, track structures, buses, and rail cars. And we will be using FY05 Department of Homeland Security bus grant money to develop anti-training for not just our bus operators, but we're going to share that with all the bus systems in the region that feed into Metro property. As the largest transit provider for the nation's capital, we take responsibility in Homeland Security with the seriousness it demands. Our approach to transit security involves partnerships with our employees, our customers, the transit police, and our other public safety partners. In 2004, we launched a training initiative called Managing Metro Emergencies. It was devised and developed in response to both the Madrid bombings and a tremendous amount of criticism that WMATA received after we had to evacuate people from a station because of a fire. This training has provided training to over 2,000 regional law enforcement, fire, rescue, Department of Transportation, and Metro personnel, and it examines mitigating, evacuating, and recovering from a major service disruption. The course puts particular emphasis on enhancing the management of the pedestrians and vehicle traffic. And it was well received by the region, so much for that firefighters in the region demanded Managing Metro Emergencies 2 class through the Council of Governments and requested Urban Area Security Initiative money so that we can actually run that in a tabletop setting. Also in partnership with the Department of Homeland Security, we did have an opportunity to pilot and launch the Behavioral Assessment Screening System training, and we have hosted over 300 Metro Transit Police and regional law enforcement officers who took this highly specialized training to spot behaviors of would-be terrorists planning to execute an attack. We have an emergency response facility which we opened in 2002. It's the only transit facility of its kind in the nation that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to train emergency personnel. It includes a mock train tunnel that allows regional emergency responders to train for disasters like smoke and fire, collisions, and terrorist incidents in a transit tunnel environment, and more than 8,000 firefighters, police officers, first responders, FBI, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and the Pentagon Police have trained at this facility, and it was given the American Public Transportation Association's Innovation Award in 2004. The training facility also houses the nation's first passenger rail emergency evacuation simulator, which is a simulator that can roll a commuter rail 180 degrees in a 10-degree increment, simulating rail car positions after derailments. And we use this rollover rig to train police, fire, and other first responders, and of course have invited any of our local colleagues like Amtrak Police to come out and experience that training. And the FRA is going to use it to assist in evaluating interior design safety of intercity and commuter passenger rail cars. We continue to be an active participant in regional exercises. Last weekend, we sponsored a regional drill that provided an opportunity for region first responders to practice their skills in a metro environment, using our own procedures, using a rescue train, testing communications. We've also participated in the regional drills and exercises sponsored by the Department of Homeland Security and the Metropolitan Washington Councils of Government. We think a critical component towards ensuring that the safety that we conduct involves our employees and regional first responders, and we also want to engage our customers, and we have. And in fact, we encourage public announcements, and I heard some discussion about that. The See It, Say It campaign, Is That Your Bag? But we also have monthly open houses where our safety, police, and corporate communications personnel do hand out evacuation information, and we've also provided opportunities for customers to come, get on a train, and learn themselves how to evacuate. And in 2004, we launched a program called Metro Citizens Corps that provides Metro-specific training ranging from rail safety and emergency preparedness to looking for terrorist activity. And then more than 200 citizens across this region have participated in that training and will participate in retraining and a drill this Sunday as well. We appreciate the important contribution that training provides, and will continue to seek opportunities to work with our employees and partners, including the Federal Transit Administration and Department of Homeland Security, to refine, expand, and progress in the training arena. I appreciate any comments that you may have or questions, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Chief. Appreciate that. The Chair will now recognize Mr. Edward Hamberger, the President and CEO of the American Association of Railroads, to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of the members of the AAR, thank you for the opportunity to discuss security training for freight railroad employees this morning. Railroads moved forcefully and comprehensively to improve security immediately after the events of 9/11. We did not wait for government mandates to develop a comprehensive security plan. Indeed, immediately following the terrorist attack, we created a top-level security task force comprised of more than 150 railroad, customer, and former intelligence personnel to conduct an exhaustive evaluation of freight rail security issues. The end result was the Terrorism Risk Analysis and Security Management Plan, a comprehensive, intelligence-driven, priority-based blueprint of actions designed to enhance freight rail security. I know, Mr. Chairman, you have received a briefing. I know that the majority and minority staff have received detailed briefings on this plan. It was adopted by the AAR in December 2001 and remains in effect today. As a result of that plan, the railroads quickly enacted more than 50 permanent security-enhancing countermeasures, such as limiting access to key rail facilities and information, and tightening up cybersecurity procedures to eliminate access to critical information. In addition, the plan defines 4 progressively higher security alert levels and details a series of specific actions to be taken at each level. Railroads test the plan through regular tabletop exercises and drills to evaluate it and modify it as necessary. Our security plan does rely heavily on the efforts of our industry's dedicated and highly professional employees. They are indeed the eyes and ears in the industry's security effort. As was true of our overall security plan, we did not wait for government mandates when it came to security training for our employees. The industry's focus has been on recognize, record, and report. The training has included what to do when an employee sees a stranger, suspicious activity, or suspicious object on rail property, to whom to report the anomaly, the need to keep information about train movements and cargoes confidential, and the need to keep rail property secure and safe. We began implementing employee security training shortly after 9/11, when the Class 1 railroads provided training videos and printed materials to all employees. In the materials, the railroads expressed to their employees 3 fundamental expectations that are the cornerstones of rail employees' responsibilities regarding security. Number 1, do not put yourself in danger. Number 2, report suspicious activities on or around railroad property. And number 3, do not divulge sensitive information about rail operations to others. Over time, freight railroads began to incorporate security issues in a more formal fashion. For example, as part of employees' periodic FRA-mandated safety rules recertifications, as part of new hire training, and as part of new manager training. Many railroads have incorporated security issues into employees' manual of standard operating procedures. Moreover, as you heard on the first panel, all railroads are compliant with U.S. DOT-mandated Hazardous Material 232 security training for employees who handle hazardous materials. More recently, railroads concluded the security would be enhanced if rail employee security training was more standardized across the industry through use of a common curriculum, and that has been accomplished. Much of the work was done in collaboration with the National Transit Institute at Rutgers University, which developed the Interactive Uniform Security Awareness Curriculum for public transit employees. With NTI's assistance, we adapted that curriculum for use by freight rail employees. It includes 4 modules: what is security, vulnerability, risk, and threat, what to look for, and employees' role in reducing risk. The goal of the standardized curriculum is to provide rail employees with an understanding of their role and responsibility in system security and how to implement the procedures upon detection of suspicious objects or activities. Also, as part of the standardized curriculum, employees are trained how to react to threats, which may take the form of perceived suspicious activity, suspicious or out-of-place objects or vehicles, evidence of tampering with equipment, or warning phone calls. Again, railroads do not expect their employees to play the hero by potentially putting themselves in harm's way. Instead, they are expected to follow company policies and procedures, informing appropriate authorities of the situation, moving to a safe location, and awaiting for further instructions. 100% of all of our employees will receive this training, and there will be a written record that they have indeed received it. It will be updated and renewed each year, and it also includes daily security briefings as part of the daily safety briefing. The Senate recently adopted an amendment regarding rail worker security training as part of the Port Security Bill. Thanks to the rail industry's proactive efforts, freight rail security training efforts already include the elements called for in that legislation. We are proud of the success we have achieved in enhancing security while keeping our nation's vital rail network operating efficiently and safely. We will continue to work with Congress, federal agencies, our employees, the communities in which we operate, and other relevant parties to further improve security and safety even more. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamberger. I will yield myself 5 minutes for first line of questioning. If I had to describe the impact of the panel, it would remind me of an old movie that I saw years ago when I was in college, and the refrain used in the movie was, "What we have here is a failure to communicate." I get different messages as I go across the panel from left to right or right to left. And I'm just trying to figure out whether there's a failure to communicate or there's something deeper than that. Mr. Wytkind and Mr. Tolman, the message I got from you was that there's been very little, if any, training of your folks, that the quality of the training is not very good, that unless you have absolute classroom setting training as opposed to videos or CDs or written material, they can't be effective. And Mr. Tolman and Mr. Wytkind, both of you seem to suggest, well, you didn't seem to suggest, you stated that a small percentage of your employees have actually received the kind of training that we've heard about. Am I missing something here? You have any response to what was said by the Chief and by Mr. Hamberger?
Absolutely. First of all, the comments, sorry.
And try and keep your comments very succinct so I can try and get folks to respond.
By the Chief, we said in our written testimony that we applaud some of the work that's being done by LA Transit and by WMATA to try to deal with these training needs. It's still not 100% where it needs to be, but they've made great strides there. On the freight side, there is a lot of material being developed. There's no doubt about it. We also acknowledge that in our written testimony. The issue is the rank and file workers are not receiving hands-on training. And so the questions need to be developed that need to focus more to the freight railroads of, how are the workers being trained? Are they being put through rigorous training classes while on the job, or are they just being sent home with interactive kind of video internet programs?
So it's not the question that the material's not good, it's the question of whether there's been a concentration of that in a integrated program to...
That's right. Although we can't embrace every piece of literature because we don't get asked to provide input. Yes, that's basically the fundamental problem.
Okay, Mr. Tolman?
Receiving it.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd have to agree with my colleague. I mean, essentially, they're not receiving anything. 83% of them said in our survey they weren't. But we took it one step further, the labor unions, and developed a hazmat training class at the George Meany Center. We currently do a class, we probably have about 2 running every month to train our members. We take this very serious as you do. We've taken the initiative in our own hand through grant money. We've done this, but we're not receiving. Our members are not receiving, and I can't speak for the transit industry because we don't represent transit employees, and so I.
Okay, Mr. Hamberger.
I had the same thought run through my mind as I was listening to Mr. Wytkind and Mr. Tolman about the failure to communicate. One of the things that will come out of our effort to have this training, which is part of the recertification process, and it's a very direct relationship between the trainer and the employee. We will have a written record. We will no longer have the discrepancy of whether or not the employees have received the training, whether or not the training is acceptable. We have submitted this series of 4 tapes to both the FRA and the TSA last February. We did hear from the TSA earlier this week, and what they said was that it was...
I'll hold more hearings from now on.
That it was relevant, up-to-date, and helpful in raising the baseline of security-related knowledge. We are committed, as I've tried to get across in my testimony, to security. We understand the importance of training of employees in security. We believe that this training program is adequate, and at the same time, I'll refer back to Mr. Sammon's comments that beginning this week, the TSA is sending 100 of their inspectors out onto the freight rail properties to take a look at whether or not we are abiding by our commitment, which we have entered into as an industry with TSA, to have rail employee training. They're doing an evaluation and a survey of that beginning this week. We will have third-party indication of whether or not the training is being done and whether or not it is effective.
Thank you. Chief, I respect everything you said, and maybe it's just because I rarely ride the metro here, but I do occasionally. But I don't, maybe I'm not attentive, but when I get on, and if we stop under the river, frankly, I don't have a sense of what I would do in terms of evacuation. Am I an odd person out on that, or do you think that most of the folks who ride your rails do have a sense of where they go if there's a problem?
I think some of the messages become wallpaper, and I know our train operators make them because we write them. And our spokesperson from the police department is here, and if you go in the subway, you hear her voice if you want to. People have iPods on, they're busy reading books, and I know myself, I've been accused of being mean because I have suggested to customers that some of this is a responsibility that they have to take. During an incident, I'm not going to be there to hold everybody's hand and show them how to evacuate. And that's why we have our information on our website, a very dynamic display of how to evacuate. It's clearly posted in a visual way that doesn't require as much reading, in case English is not the primary language. And that's why we created this.
So that's where I'd go find it.
There's a number of opportunities to find it, and that's why we do the outreach. And in September, which was National Preparedness Month, We outreached every week, but...
Yeah, I'm not trying to be critical. I'm trying to figure out how we solve this problem. You've got our nation's capital where you have millions of people that come as visitors. They don't ride it every day or every week or every month. They come into town.
Clearly, they would have to follow the instructions of the train operator. Right. And I do agree that training needs to be more robust. Once you watch this, this is about it. Then how do you take it up a notch? And how you take it up a notch is by taking groups of employees and putting them in practical situations, and that costs money. And it costs overtime, because if the train operator, the bus operator, and the transit policeman are in some training facility, who's providing the service? And the primary mission of the railroad and the bus company is to drive people around and give them a ride. And so there is a huge expense, and if you look at the transit grants, listening to TSA say now they're going to make everybody take their transit grant money, if you only get a couple $1 million, poof, that's gone. And some of the capital investment is necessary, and there's an expectation that the public has that a transit property is doing technology, training, public service campaigns, so you have scarce funding spread around and diluted then, and being able to provide transit grant money to do backfill overtime is really what's going to help transit properties get employees in situations where they're not having to watch a video in the bus operator's lounge during a break, and can actually work with first responders in a situation that replicates the stress and the immediate decision-making that's required to act the way we need people to act when there's an emergency. I think the American public is not engaged because they don't want to be. And particularly in this region, I think New Yorkers, because it happened there, they have a recognition of the need to be prepared that we don't sense in this region and other parts of America. But the American public does have to accept some responsibility for what's going to happen in an emergency, because in the beginning moments it is going to be chaotic and the first responders won't be there. And that's when it's so necessary to be able to do what you need to do, which is why we took hundreds of CERT members, the people we've trained to evacuate, participated in this drill where we had a train under the water and we had to evacuate people, and it took longer than we thought it was going to take. And we used the cache of radios that this region has, and communication wasn't what it should have been, and all those things which just highlight once again where we should be focusing our attention with our operational employees. The train operator didn't keep giving messaging to the customers. So there are issues, and unless you really practice them in a situation like that, watching a video is okay, but it's not really what you want to do. But the industry doesn't have the money to spend, and mandating that people spend their little bit of transit security grant money, I don't think is going to get us there either.
Sanchez recognized for 5 minutes.
I like this, Chief. I don't think she said anything differently than what I heard out of the people who represent the workers. And I'm just going to tell you from my standpoint, you know, I go up to New York maybe a couple times a year, and I go up to the Bay Area in California maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and I'm here, and once in a while I use the transit, certainly when I'm in those other cities, and here when I have to go anywhere off the hill and the transit can be used, I use it. And you know, I'm actually one of those people who gets on in the car and I look around and see who's there. Am I going to have any problems? You know, where are the exits? I listen to what the guy is saying, and I read any of the signs that tell me, but you know what? These cars can stop anywhere, under the tunnel, under the river, on top of a bridge or what have you. And then what am I going to do? I mean, as a person who uses these infrequently, I'm relying on the train operator and any different station in New York. Each station is different. Some stations have locked stairways now because, you know, they either cuts or security problems. They don't keep all the exits open, and doesn't have a thing that says don't go this way. I mean, if you're running through, depending on what station you're in, you're running through, you don't know where to run, you don't know that the gate's going to be locked if there's a fire going on. So you do depend on the transit workers to keep their wits about them, to know what they're doing, to stay there and continue to get everybody out, except in the case of their own personal safety. I can understand that. But, you know, if they're not, I don't expect them to know that off of a video. We take videos home all the time. We take reports home all the time. And half the time when we take them, they sit there in the pile. We don't get a chance to read them for whatever reason. We're supposed to read it for the next morning, and guess what? You're tired when you get home, or you have to make dinner for, you know, the husband or what have you, so, or vice versa, or what have you. So I'm just saying that, you know, a video, and takeout, a video, a video isn't the same as putting the time allotted to an employee, not just once, but in the classroom, in situations where you can see he didn't keep telling the people what to do. It took a lot longer to get people out. The stairways were locked where we thought they wouldn't be, or what, or, you know, everybody ran for the elevator and the elevator didn't work, whatever it is. I mean, they need to do this, because someone like me, even though I get on the train and I look around and I think about what I'm doing, I'm still not going to know. And I need to rely on those people. And what I'm hearing is that just really isn't getting done. And the employees want it, and I'm sure the chief wants it, but the money hasn't been dedicated to doing that. And, you know, the first 15 minutes of a disaster, whatever it may look like, is the time when you save lives or you don't. And that all comes down to who's trained and who's not. So we've got to figure out how we get this done, Mr. Chairman. If we mandate it, and we got to figure out, I know the fare box recovery rates. You know, I worked in that for a long time. I know it's tough out there. So we need to figure out if this is a priority, how are we going to fund it? I would ask across the table, do you believe that the federal government should mandate security training for rail and mass transit employees?
Like me to start? Obviously, from my testimony, we've been calling for a mandate for some time. And I also think there needs to be some consideration to the difference between the private freight rail industry and the public transportation industry in this country. I believe resources need to be provided to the metro operators around the country to help pay for security across the board, including training. But I also think if you look at what the stock pickers and the Wall Street analysts are saying about the freight railroads, they can afford to train their workers. They've got all the money they need to train the workers in this country who operate and maintain the nation's freight railroads. And that ought to just be a very specific mandate, and you're going to do it. And then it needs to be overseen by the Department of Homeland Security and this committee to make sure it's done. Whereas on the public transportation side, I believe you need to add some resources to it as well, because I do believe there are resource issues in these public transit operators, and they have to be addressed.
Absolutely, I agree with my colleague. I also do like the chief as well. I like what she said. You know, money, overtime equals training. I mean, that's what it's about. I just have to get my colleague Ed Hamberger to agree with me. You know, we've been in national negotiations with the railroads for the past year and a half. You know what their #1 issue has been? Reduce crew size from 2 to 1 in the middle of national security. I think, you know, it's about the money. And you're absolutely right. First responders, we are the first responders. That's why we're concerned. That's why we're doing hazmat training. Absolutely agree with you. Thank you.
I believe it should be mandated if it's funded and developed with consultation and involvement of stakeholders to include union personnel.
Number one, I appreciate Mr. Wytkind's stock picks. I'll be sure to call him next time I have a spare dollar to invest. Number two, I will not comment on what is being discussed by those people who are negotiating across the table in the round of labor discussions. Number three, we did not object to the legislation adopted by the Senate. As I indicated both in my written and oral statement, we believe that we are meeting the requirements put into the Senate bill. We believe that we are meeting the requirements that DHS has asked us to take on and which we have agreed to do on a voluntary basis and for which we pay. And we are meeting the requirements developed by the Department of Transportation, PHMSA, whatever that officially stands for, and the requirements that has, the higher requirements for the movement of hazardous material.
Chairman Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hamberger,
Sir.
it isn't mandatory, right, up at this point for
The
you?
FMCA requirements are mandatory, yes, sir. That's for hazardous material.
Hazardous material, but not regular cargo.
That is correct.
Okay. Now, what would it cost you, what would it cost the railroads to train these people?
We are training them, as I indicated.
But you haven't got, I mean, the numbers are still pretty low, aren't they? You don't argue with the argument that only like 30% or 20% of your workers have been trained?
No, I do take exception to that. That is not what my members indicate. But to set that issue aside, we have adopted this more formal approach whereby every employee, not just those in the front line, but every employee will receive the training, and there will be a written record that they've received it when they've received it. So we disagree that how many have been, but going forward, it'll be 100%.
I think what the fellows from the labor unions are saying is that the training thus far has been inadequate. They feel that
is their view. Obviously.
That is their view, that it has been inadequate, that it is not sufficient. And what you're and as I understand it, now that they're going to make this mandatory, then the question will be, how long will it take you to train all of your people? And I'm interested in the cost. I think it's important for the Congress to understand the cost. And I agree with the chief that, in my view, the transit people are going to have help here. And you can't take the money out of all the capital funds. You won't have any capital projects. I mean, I think we have to provide the training money on top. Now, the railroads are probably going to have to pick this up, yes, knowing this administration. So what's it going to cost you?
Can I develop that and get back to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. I mean, but it will cost some money.
It clearly will.
And is that the reason why it hasn't been done up to this point?
Well, I would disagree with the assertion that it hasn't been done up to this point. As I tried to indicate, we have done training. We have adopted this.
But is the training just the video and the brochure? Do you have any actual facilities where you train people?
Indeed,
the chief has a place where they train people.
I'm embarrassed that I did not bring it to the fore before you asked the question. We indeed have the world's foremost training facility in Pueblo, Colorado, 56 square mile training facility which we operate under contract with the Federal Railroad Administration. Our hazardous materials emergency response teams are trained there. We train a number of emergency response units from around the country. In fact, many of our customers, Dow and DuPont, send their emergency response teams to Pueblo for training. And we do that. Our own employees, obviously, we pay for. And if I can put a plug in, Senator Salazar did put in the port security bill an amendment making Pueblo eligible as the National Defense Preparedness Curriculum for funding. Under questioning, the Department of Homeland Security admitted that there is a basic flaw in that program in that there is nowhere to have people trained on the ground, hands-on, in dealing with exploding rail cars and how to deal with emergency response for hazardous materials. So that is where we train. And I think that, if I may, sir, the issue is not every employee is an emergency responder.
No, I understand that.
So
that's why we're talking about
training the emergency responders.
So you're doing the emergency response,
yes,
but the rest of it, you don't have facilities for a special place where you're training these people, like the chief does for her people.
It is done as part of the training and the recertification.
Is it done on the clock or off the clock?
I believe it'd be on the clock. Yeah, be on the clock.
So you're paying for it?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Chief, let's go back to your point here, and I appreciate your candor and your directness in answering the questions. Am I right? Wouldn't it be better if Congress provided the money for the training without taking it out of your capital funds?
Yes, because in fact, the Congresswoman made a comment about time, and the chemical detection systems, we know, because we have one, does save time. In the sarin gas attack, it was half an hour, 40 minutes before they knew what they had. When you have a system like that, it's moments then you can shut down trains, stop trains from coming in, do things with your exhaust fans. So now if you tell people you got a couple $1 million, but you got to spend it on training, don't spend it on your capital, people aren't going to be able to do everything. And in fact, they can't do much of anything now with a couple $1 million, as much as cameras and other things cost. So if we're going to mandate training, it has to be funded. And there has to be consideration for the fact that with operational employees, who most of them are union folks, doesn't matter, operational or not, they've got to be replaced when they're not there to run the railroad or drive a bus. So who's going to shoulder that cost? And the bottom line for the Transit Authority is that they can't. They'd like to do it, but they can't because there are other infrastructure needs, keeping the buses running, keeping the trains up to date, repairing the railroad. That requires that capital. So if we're going to mandate it, it's got to be funded.
Well, I just want to commend the chairman again for holding this hearing. I think the chairman has leaned forward on all these areas. What shocks me is that this is like so many other areas with Homeland Security where we're simply not doing as much as needs to be done. And I think as this Congress comes to its conclusion, I hope we can keep doing this, Mr. Chairman, because I do think it has a positive effect in getting them, Homeland Security, to realize that they've got to do more to safeguard the American people.
Well, I appreciate the gentleman's comments. I just would have to make one comment, however. We can't gainsay the fact that that we have spent, what is it, $18 billion from the federal government on security overall. We do need to spend more, but I hope we're not coming to the point that money is the only thing. Obviously, you're going to have, in my judgment, requirements that we have to spend more money, but I would hope that we don't take the position that it's just a management employment issue, or that people will not participate in training unless they're absolutely paid or paid overtime or double time or whatever it is, because, for God's sakes, you're talking about their lives too. And I would hope that people would want to be involved in training programs that train them how to save their lives and the lives of others. And while money does come into it, I hope we're not going to just put it down to a question of money, because God knows we will never have enough money to do everything we want to do. And I hope, and if the administration is taking a tack, at least to begin the process of leveraging money they do have to try and get the recipients, the potential recipients of that money, to start thinking about training as a part of that, frankly, that's a good thing. Yes, we put more money to it, but if you have a certain amount of money and you go back and you look at it and you say, hey, wait a second, we haven't paid enough attention on training. Let's use the money that we do have to leverage it, not all for training, but as they ask for capital investment, we want to make sure that they've got a training component. Frankly, I think that's a good thing. It's not the total answer, but I would hope that it's a beginning.
Mr. Chairman, may
Yes.
I say something? I think you're right. I mean, it's always about resources and trying to put them in the right place and getting the most you can. But I've got to tell you that, again, if I'm a writer on a system, I want that employee to know what they're doing, because I'm depending on them. And my life, to a large extent, may depend on their knowing what they're doing. And what troubles me is, not that this would be a union management thing, what troubles me is that these union representatives are telling me, basically, that their employees are not confident.
Oh, I heard that loud and clear. And we better answer that.
That they will do the job that is required of them and that they want to do to save my life.
Absolutely.
And I want that employee to be confident that he knows or she knows what they're doing if I'm in an emergency and I'm depending on them.
I agree. That's why I'm heartened by the fact Mr. Sammon said they're going to start sending people out to the field to actually certify or to do evaluations to see whether Mr. Hamberger's folks are doing what they say they're doing. Again, not a total answer, but at least moving in the right direction. And I know Mr. Dix.
It's been 5 years,
Mr. Dix has suggested that they do it on the eve of a hearing.
5 years, and these gentlemen have followed this very closely, and they see that the administration continues to analyze and think, but they don't get out and do anything. And I hope the pressure of this hearing, I hope at least they'll start doing something at
Well, we
at
will
long last.
continue having hearings. And I want to thank the panel. You've been very helpful to our consideration of this matter. As we mentioned, members of the committee may have some additional questions for you. And if they do, we would ask you to respond to those in writing. The hearing record will be held open for 10 days, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.